Hello everyone, welcome back to Powerful Nothing and Magic the Gathering Cube podcast. I'm your host Dan, and as always, I'm joined by James. James, how have you been this week?
I've been good. The UK continues to be very warm. We all can't cope with it, but we're carrying on.
We'll be fine. It's only 30 degrees. We've got another 5 degrees before we spend a full 5 minutes complaining about the weather. But no, let's crack on. Today we have an awesome topic. Today we're going to be doing a bit of a deep dive into Aristocrats in Cube. It's always been a really fun archetype, and today, we're going to give some tips and tricks to support it and how to draft it in your own cubes. Before we get into that main topic, a quick bit of housekeeping. There will be a card gallery down in the show notes below if you want to see any of the cards that we're talking about today, along with a link to a YouTube version if you want to see the pretty pictures move around the screen. There will also be timecodes if you want to jump around to specific sections of the episode, and while you're down there, please consider giving the podcast a 5-star review, thumbs up, all that good stuff greatly helps us out. Right, preamble out of the way, let's crack on with our main topic. So, James, let's talk about Aristocrats. Kind of give me an overview of what an Aristocrats deck is trying to do.
Yeah, so Aristocrats is an archetype named after, I believe the original was Falconrath Aristocrat, maybe? I don't know. But Aristocrats is an archetype based around sacrificing creatures for some sort of advantage. So this can be just sacrificing to get a good sacrifice trigger, or sacrificing to trigger some of your other effects. But that might be drawing cards, that might be dealing damage with something like a Blood Artist. But that's how we're trying to get ahead in this deck, is by sacrificing our creatures. And it can have quite a few different sort of overall game plans. You can have very aggressive versions with sort of 1-mana creatures that are recursive and looking to get in damage early and then drain them out. Or you can have more grindy versions looking to sort of accrue card advantage with your sacrifice triggers. And there's even some combo stuff you can do as well. I think the Gravecrawler combos, for example, go really well in the Aristocrats deck.
Yeah, there's definitely some nice overlap, because kind of like a lot of creature-based combos revolve around like the free sacrifice outlets, which kind of you get inherently and you need in an Aristocrat deck. So that's all really nice. In terms of like cubes, James, what type of cubes do you think an Aristocrat deck can show up in?
So I say generally sort of mid to low power level. While it can be a really strong strategy, it's the sort of full-on Aristocrats deck tends to not quite get there in the highest power level cubes, just because it's a little bit vulnerable to disruption. And you're playing a few too many sort of slightly weak cards in order to enable your synergies. That being said, in sort of high power cubes, you do see, there are little pockets of sacrifice synergy, even, some of the most powerful cards in those cubes, things like Gut, Broadside Bombardiers, do involve sacrificing cards, and you can build around those a little bit, but you certainly don't have anything that you would call an Aristocrats deck. But it is very common in sort of mid-power level cubes. I think Rakdos Aristocrats has to be one of the most commonly listed archetypes when you look at those cubes.
Yeah, it's kind of like Azorius Flyers, Selesnya +1/+1 counters, Rakdos Sacrifice, that kind of stuff, or Rakdos Aristocrats, yeah.
Exactly. And I think often you see it listed and it doesn't quite come together that much, because either there's not deep enough support, or sometimes the support just isn't really all pushing in the same direction. So, for example, you might see a bunch of the 1-mana aggressive creatures pushing you towards an aggressive Aristocrats build, but then like the sacrifice outlets are more towards the grindy card advantage end, and you end up with not a particularly coherent game plan, even when you do get a bunch of the theoretically good Aristocrats cards. So I think it is one where, people often, I think, tend to default to building this by just adding a bunch of cards they think of as good Aristocrats cards and not really thinking through what they actually want the deck to look like. And that can certainly cause some issues when you actually try and draft a thing.
Yeah, definitely. I think this can kind of fall into a similar sort of hole that kind of like when we talked about the graveyard deck a few weeks ago, kind of it can fall into the trap of, well, I'll just throw some graveyard cards in and let the players sort it out. It's kind of a similar thing with Aristocrats. Like, yeah, the theory behind it is, I want sacrifice outlets, I want things to die, I want things that benefit, but kind of like actually tailoring it to what the deck is actually end up going to look like is going to be really important.
Yeah, for sure. And you want to be thinking as well, right, about how committed you are to the Aristocrats thing. Like, are you supporting this as a full-fledged archetype or more as just a package? Because if it's more of a package, you really want to emphasize sort of strong standalone cards, which just get better with some sacrifice synergies. Whereas if it's a full-blown archetype, then you're going to want more redundancy, so you might end up being okay playing some sort of slightly weaker standalone cards because they enable your synergies really well. It's not that any of these approaches are right or wrong. You just need to be thinking about these decisions up front as you're building your cube, hopefully not just like ruffling through your box and finding like 30 cards that look like they're good in Aristocrats.
Yeah, exactly. I think my general rule with an Aristocrat deck, or with an Aristocrat style environment, is kind of like, the lower powered the cube is, the more it's like an archetype. The more it's like it's what Rakdos or a color combination involving black is doing. The more powerful the cube get, the more it's like a package. The more it's like doing cool stuff with Goblin Bombardment. That's kind of Aristocratic adjacent. Would you kind of go along with that, James?
Yeah, it can be cool stuff with Goblin Bombardment, or it can be, just enabling some of these really high power level cards that involve sacrificing stuff. Like you might have like your only repeatable sack outlet is like Yawgmoth, for example, because Yawgmoth's just a super powerful card, and it's you don't have to build around it that much for it to be worth including. Whereas, if you're trying to include Viscerous here, for example, it's you need a lot more effort to make that card actually good.
Yeah, and sorry, I just bring back. We touched a little bit on colors, but kind of like in terms of colors, like we've mentioned black and we mentioned Rakdos. It's are we fair to say that kind of like if you want to support Aristocrats, you have to support it in black? But like, what colors can we combine with black, James, to kind of give us decks, and how do the different colors give us different options?
Yeah, for sure. So I think Rakdos is probably the most popular. It tends to lean a little bit more aggressive, but it doesn't have to. But red certainly brings that element. You can also certainly black-white and black-green are both very viable. Black-green tends to lean a bit more into the recursion stuff. It's very grindy. Black-white is really good at the like drain you out stuff. There's a lot of really powerful black-white gold cards specifically around that. Plus, white gives you really good token making, which is something Aristocrats is definitely interested in to get that fodder to sacrifice with. I'd say blue-black is the only one you tend not to see very often, I guess.
That seems tough.
Yeah, I guess you can do some like zombie tribal stuff, can do a little bit of this,
That's
right?
true.
But generally it's blue-black's not where it's at, but any of the other black color combinations can be viable, certainly.
Yeah, I'd agree. And like when I've supported Aristocrats in my cubes in the past, like I think we mentioned this in our episode last week, that kind of like when I had Aristocrats in my main cube, it was kind of three colors. I tried to tailor the decks a little bit to just so it wasn't like a Aristocrat schmoz, and you didn't end up with like a soup style environment. But it was more like, yeah, the Rakdos Aristocrats was way more aggressive. You had kind of like cards like Judith and like Mayhem Devil that kind of like are leading you to kind of like get as much damage in as quickly as possible. Whereas in Orzhov, where I was also supporting Aristocrats, I had some like some of the cool drain effects, like there's like Elias Il Core, but also like a card like Lurus can go quite nicely in a like it's a more grindy style of card in an Aristocrat deck, because you kind of like, I sack my thing, I replay it. That's more grindy than like the it's slower but a bit more resilient, and like and yeah, I found that to be quite nicely. I found that to work quite nicely, but like you can definitely make it work with any black X color combination that we've mentioned, obviously apart from blue. Aristocrats,
I think, is certainly the premier home for the non-companioned Lurus, right? It's You just have so many cheap creatures that you're proactively putting in your graveyard. All that recursion stuff actually works out really, really well.
No, exactly. In terms of the deck itself, we've mentioned some different card types. Let's actually give some examples, James. Kind of broadly speaking, like what does an Aristocrat deck need to function? What things need to exist in a cube? And if you're then drafting it, do you need in your deck to make an Aristocrat deck actually work?
Yeah, so I'd say to get your synergies going, there's sort of three key categories, three ingredients, if you like, which are really necessary. But certainly some cards can fill multiple of these roles at the same time. I'd say the three things we really need are sack fodder, so like disposable creatures. This can be tokens, or it can just be creatures that are worth less than a card. You know, you don't want to be sacrificing a creature which didn't do anything else for you, right? You don't want to just be playing my 2-mana card. It doesn't do anything when it enters the battlefield, and then I sacrifice it. That's generally not going to be a good deal for you. But if your 2-mana card, say, drew you a card on the way in, or had a trigger when it died, it granted you some more value along the way, then that can be fine. But also just token generators are great. Obviously, that's a source of creatures which didn't cost you much to get into play, so we can sacrifice them and feel pretty good about that.
Like a card like Lingering Souls goes so hard in an Aristocrat deck because it's one card for 4 bodies.
Exactly.
And we love that.
So much. That's so much. It's so efficient. Then we obviously need sacrifice outlets, ways to sacrifice our creatures. A scenario you can really commonly end up with in Aristocrats is, if all my creatures die, my opponent is dead, but I can't manufacture a way for that to happen. So we really need some sacrifice outlets. Ideally, sacrifice outlets that don't cost mana to activate.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, like no matter like that. This is it's kind of like a golden rule. No matter what the power level of your cube is, because there are commons that are free sack outlets. Things like Nantuko Husk, that like 2 and a black has a free sacrifice on it. We never want to be curtailed by mana with this deck. We want to be able to sacrifice them at instant speed whenever we want, and the free sacrifice outlets are so important to this deck. Like, it's almost not worth running if you don't do that.
Yeah, for sure. And a big reason why, as well, why they have to be free, right, is it's often not like I'm sacrificing one thing a turn for 4 turns. It's like I'm sacrificing nothing and then I'm sacrificing 10 things in a turn, you know? And we don't want to be held back by mana for when we can do that.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
And then the final thing which we need, which sometimes the sacrifice outlet can double up as this, but we need a payoff. Now, some of our sacrifice outlets are going to be their own payoff. Think about something like Yawgmoth. 2 black, 2/4, protection from humans, has a discard ability we don't care about, but can pay a life, sack a creature to put a -1/-1 counter on a creature and draw a card. That is its own payoff, right? You're sacrificing creatures to kill their creatures and draw yourself cards. We don't need anything else to be triggering along the way there. But Yawgmoth's kind of expensive to cast, and if we want to look at the cheaper ones, there we might need a payoff. For example, if your sacrifice outlet was a Viscera Seer, for example, which is a 1-mana 1/1, you can sacrifice a creature to scry 1. We're not going to feel good about just proactively sacrificing a bunch of creatures to scry on the top of our deck. That's generally going to be worth less than the creature we sacrificed. So if that's our sack outlet, we want some other payoffs along the way. So that might be something like a Blood Artist to drain them out. That's the 2-mana 0/1. Whenever a creature dies, we drain our opponent for 1. Or it might be something like Grim Horror Specs, maybe, or Midnight Reaper. These are cards that draw as cards when creatures die. But yeah, we want something else that's triggering and going on the stack when we're doing our sacrificing. Mayhem Devil, also a really powerful one here.
Yeah, and those cards are really important because that's really what helps give this deck reach. Like the Blood Artists or the payoffs, that's what actually makes the deck tick and make it scary. Like, it's you're trying to make the math miserable for your opponent, basically. Like if it's a blood artist in play, you're trying to get them down to just enough life so that if you sack your whole board, that's the final 5 points of damage. Or if your payoffs, like something like the Nantuko Husk I mentioned, that's 2 and a black, 2/2, sack a creature. This creature gets +2/+2 until end of turn. The kind of dream scenario in lower power level cubes is you have like 2 of these effects out. Your opponent has 1 blocker. You attack with both of them. They can't block both. You sack your whole board to the one that's unblocked, and that gets through for an obscene amount of damage. It's like it's a different way of killing them to a blood artist. But the point is that, as James touched on earlier, we're going to sack our whole board in one go when it's really most optimal, and like it's kind of almost it's like the final bits of damage to push us over the edge. That's kind of where we're kind of going with this.
Yeah, exactly. You have a lot of different angles of attack as well, right? Because the Nantuko Husk, for example, it is shocking how early in the game that card becomes must block. And at a certain point, it just becomes like the Abyss, right? Even if you can't kill them right away, they're just having to throw something in the way because you're always threatening to just sacrifice your whole board and kill them. And that can be really powerful in a long game. Also, a lot of why Blood Artist is so powerful and why it's, in my mind, like still one of the best, if not the best, of these effects, despite lots of more modern iterations on it, is that it triggers off anything dying. You don't have it's not like Mayhem Devil where it has to be sacrificed. It's not like a lot of the other ones where it only sees your creatures. So if just combat happens, Blood Artist triggers so many times, and you can win a lot of games that you have no right to win just because you're chump blocking loads and you have a Blood Artist in play, and your opponent is like, I've been winning this game for the last 10 turns.
Yeah.
You've been about to die all that time, but somehow, like, the Blood Artist player, despite being on the back foot the whole game, the Blood Artist player is on 15 and their opponent is on 5, And it can be really scary to play against.
Yeah, no, I agree. Like in the current iteration of my cube, I'm not supporting full aristocrats, but like there's a couple of things that oddly sacrifice creatures. Stuff like we've mentioned, Goblin Bombardment and Yawgmoth today. They're just in my cube because they're good cards. So I've kind of put Blood Artist and like Marionette Apprentice back in my cube because I think they're very powerful. They can close out a game, and that with like a cup with like the tiniest of the tiniest of aristocrats energies can just lead to a deck. But like let's actually kind of we've kind of gone in detail in some of those sections, but let's actually kind of talk about things that we actually like in those different sections. So the 3 key parts of an aristocrat deck are the token makers, something that puts things on the board for us to sacrifice, our sacrifice outlets, and our kind of payoffs. Let's actually deep dive into some different ones that we like. So kind of, I think firstly, like let's touch on token makers. I think that kind of is a good place to start because it also kind of, with the different colors, shows us what they can offer. James, let's start with black, for example, because we know in our aristocrat deck we're going to have black. What are your favorite repeatable ways of making tokens or bodies in black for an aristocrat deck?
Yeah, for sure. So we have a couple of really strong ones here, and as with all these categories, the best ones are the ones that are just good cards in their own right and instantly get a bunch better when we have these sacrifice synergies, right? So think about Bitter Blossom. Like, Bitter Blossom is a card that has seen a ton of play across a bunch of different formats in Magic without anyone ever sacrificing a fairy. But if we do have ways to sack those fairies for value, it gets super, super powerful. It can just run away with game on turn 2, but you can also play it on turn 2. You've accumulated 4 or 5 fairies, and then you start sacrificing them, and that's how you close out the game. But if you want a bit more redundancy than that for this effect, you can look at creatures like Jadar, Ghoulcaller of Nephalia is quite good. That's that's one that makes a decayed zombie every turn. So the tokens don't do a lot on their own, but they do. They get sacrificed. You'll get another one. If you're getting a good payoff from that, they're quite strong. It's also quite nice with that the decayed zombies can kill themselves by attacking. So even if you're missing a sack outlet, but you have a good trigger, sometimes you can just the ability to proactively kill your own creatures is quite nice. But then if we're looking outside of black, like red has a bunch of really good options, like the Rabble Master variants are quite nice here, and are probably cards that are going to be in a bunch of your cubes anyway, rather than specific includes for Aristocrats.
Yeah. Yeah, for me, that's one of the key reasons why Rakdos actually leans more aggressive, is because its best way of making tokens is on things that are turning sideways. Like black, for example. Like, yeah, you mentioned Jadar, but you also have things like a Fearmancer that they're kind of like, they're almost wanting you to kind of like, not hold down the board, but like you get their value by just like passing the turn. Whereas with red, we get the value by turning things sideways. So therefore the whole deck is lent more aggressive because of that. Like, yeah, like the classic Goblin Rabble Master is Goblin Rabble Master. 2 and a red, 2/2 creature Goblin Warrior. Other Goblin creatures you control attack each combat if able. See, it's not even a choice. At the beginning of combat on your turn, create a 1/1 red Goblin creature token with haste, and whenever Goblin Rabble Master attacks, it gets +1/+1 until end turn for each other attacking Goblin. So this has the word attack on it, or like twice. It's telling you what it's leading you down the rabbit hole of this is what we are doing in red, and that's why Rakdos is way more aggressive than some of the other cards, because to an extent we don't have the choice. We are going in.
Yeah, for sure. And sometimes these decks can live in that middle ground, right, between Aristocrats and just go wide aggro. Like, you can have decks where it's like, sometimes I kill you with my tokens because there's a Trumpet Blast, and sometimes I kill you with my tokens because there's a Sack Outlet and a Blood Artist, and those can both be strong. I'm aware it's not actually Trumpet Blast because we live in 2026, but some powerful modern updated version of that effect.
And what other types of effects are there, James, that we could use in the slot of like a card that is in our deck to die, basically?
Yeah, so another one that works quite well is just recursive creatures, so creatures that return themselves from the graveyard to play or to your hand. There's a couple of different variants of this. There's certainly one which there's a ton of redundancy for, is very aggressive leading versions of this effect. There's so many specifically 1-mana black creatures with 2 power that can return themselves from the graveyard. Think things like Gutterbones, Forsaken Miner, Blood-Soaked Champion. There's a ton of redundancy here. Gravecrawler even. And what these do for you is you play them on turn 1, they're going to get in a bunch of points of damage early without requiring any synergies, just because they have 2 power for 1 mana. And that means that your Blood Artist is so much scarier when your opponent's on 10 because you attacked them a bunch of time with your dorky little creatures. You're fine to throw them away to get attacks in because they're just going to come back. So to give you an example for you, so Gutterbones is a single black for a 2/1, enters tapped. You can pay 1 black, return it from your graveyard to your hand, activate only during your turn if an opponent lost life this turn. And these are just creatures we're fine throwing into our opponent's blockers to get some damage through, and then later on we can start sacrificing them for value, and we get that grindy plan going of sack my guy, bring my guy back. We're not going to want to do it early because it tends to be a bunch of mana investment, but late on that can be an engine, and if we're getting damage out of that engine, that can be the reach that we need. There are slower versions of this attack, things like Reassembling Skeleton, which is
definitely for lower
vibes,
powered environments, but I do love that card. Yeah.
Yeah, there's if you want to lead more into a grindy version, you can go more down that road, but obviously it is lower power level. But these can be strong, and especially if your payoffs and your sack outlets are also leaning aggressive, then the 1-mana 2/1 tribal can certainly be a direction to go with these.
Yeah, I do love a recursive aggressive creature. I'm kind of bummed out that I can't really run too many of them in my queue nowadays. I think the only one I've got is Gravecrawler, which is sort of for vibes, but also for some combo stuff. But yeah, I do love those creatures because they're quite useful in a bunch of different decks. Are there any other creatures that kind of fill this role of like being fodder for our sack outlets?
Yeah, for sure. So we can play sort of non-token creatures that don't need to recur themselves if they just gave us some other value before they died, you know? So, for example, a creature like Dusk Legion Zealot. This is 1 black for 1/1. When it ETPs, you draw a card and lose life. A black Elvish Visionary, basically. Because this gave us most of the value we needed on the way in, right? We already got our card. We're therefore just fine throwing this under the bus and sacrificing it for some more value. Can also be like interactive value creatures, right? Something like Bone Shredder, the 2 and a black 1/1 flying. When it ETBs, you destroy a creature and it has Echo. Right? It was going to go away next upkeep anyway with the Echo. No one wants to pay Echo on that card. So we'll very happily sacrifice. So it gets way better if we can sacrifice it for some value before it's going to die anyway. And one way you can like get a lot of these in for free, right, is if you can find ways to sort of cut other interactive spells for that effect on a creature can be really nice, you know? Like maybe instead of an extra removal spell, you play like Ravenous Chupacabra, you know, and just it lets you get that creature density in your deck, which can be really, really strong for Aristocrats.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Tailoring your like staple effects to be what deck wants is something that's very important in Cube. And yeah, you're completely right. And in like a similar vein, if you're doing like similarly in black, you might also want like a hand attack spell. So you could run a card like Mesmeric Fiend. This is 1 black for a 1/1. When a creature enters, target opponent reveals their hand, and you choose a non-land card from exile of that card. Then as a separate trigger, when this creature leaves the battlefield, return the exiled card to its owner's hand. So like with this, you can do the cool old card thing of you can respond to the trigger and sack it, so the card never comes back. So you're turning this creature into a duress style of effect, but you've also had a creature dying through that loop. So maybe you've drained them for 1. Maybe you can get this creature back for more value later. That's kind of what you can do with this type of archetype.
Yeah, for sure. Pretty powerful as an effect, and gives your players the opportunity to feel clever, which we all know is very important.
Yeah, like that specifically. That little trick. It's kind of like it's the same as like why Brainstorm is still legal in Legacy. It's like it makes people feel something.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like I'm good at magic. I can do this. Nice. And yeah, kind of like we've touched on like different effects, but like the other colors will have them as well. So like we touched on like, for example, we touched on Rabblemaster effects in like red, but like white does have them too with things like Adeline or like Brimaz. So like don't just stick to what we have said. There's a bunch of other effects in the colors and like that you can run. Same as like cards that come in and get value. White has a bunch of those as well. You don't just need to stick to the cards that we've mentioned in black. Like that's basically where you're looking. Right. We've also touched on some other good sacrifice outlets, James, but kind of like I think we both kind of agreed that like Yorgmoth Thran Physician is kind of S tier. I would put Goblin Bombardment up there as well, just because it's the sacrifice outlet and the payoff all in one go. Goblin Bombardment, I'll just read it, is 1 red enchantment, sack a creature, Goblin Bombardment deals 1 damage to any target. That is your drain effect, as it were, and your sacrifice outlets in one card. That's very nice and neat. We're kind of like, if those are kind of like S tier, James, what else do you like?
For the sack outlets, I think if we just want, if we are flush for payoffs and all we want is a cheap way to get our creatures in the bin, then you can look at stuff like Viscera Seer or Carrion Feeder, because these are just super efficient. They're only 1 mana. We didn't need to invest much in them, and we can get our stuff dead. Sometimes that's what we want. But there's also a bunch where we get a little bit more of the payoff for it along the way, and that can be really nice because it means that it's basically filling 2 of those roles, right? there's also the issue with some of these ones like Viscera, where they themselves are quite vulnerable to removal. And if you run them out early and they get killed, then you can be left without that key sacrifice outlet later when you would actually want to sacrifice your creatures, right? It's not like you're going to just bin all your stuff in response. You want to have flexibility. You want to sacrifice your stuff at the right time when you have the right payoffs, when it makes strategic sense. Maybe you've got to block in along the way before you sacrificed it, stuff like that. So the sacrifice outlets that are resistant to removal are also quite powerful. That's another big upside of something like Goblin Bombardment. Another one I think is actually really quite powerful and pretty underrated is Greater Gargadon.
I love that one. But read out for the listeners, James.
Yeah, for sure. So Greater Gargadon is a bargain 10 mana, so 9 and a red for a...
bargain, James.
Bargain,
value.
Absolutely. Crushes on efficiency. You get a 9/7 creature beast, but crucially it has suspend 10 for a single red mana. So we suspend it for a red. We're going to remove a suspend counter every turn in our upkeep. And after we've got rid of 10 of those suspend counters, we're going to cast it and it's going to gain haste, and that's going to be great. 10 turns is quite a lot of turns, but we can sacrifice an artifact, creature, or land to remove a time counter from it, only if Greater Gargadon is suspended. So this essentially is a free sack outlet, right? We don't need to invest any mana to remove the time counter. We only needed to spend 1 red mana up front. It's completely resistant to removal because they can't interact with this while it's suspended, right?
It's not on the board.
Exactly.
They can't interact. It's kind of an emblem, if that makes sense.
For sure. Plus, once we've done this enough times, we're going to get this huge hasty threat at the end of it. It's annoyingly hidden in suspend. If you don't know how suspend works, it's not obvious that it gives haste, but this will come in with haste once you've removed the last time counter. And 9/7 is huge, you know? It doesn't have trample, so ideally you'd like a way to get their stuff out of the way, but it's a huge threat. It's no mana. It's also worth noting with this that the way it's templated, even if you only have 1 suspend counter left, you can actually sacrifice like 10 creatures if that's what you want to do. Because you're sacrificing as part of the cost, but you're removing time counters as part of the resolution, you can just sacrifice a creature in response to the trigger. You sacrifice another creature and you can sack your board if that's what you want to do. Also worth noting, obviously, is it's not just creature. We can sacrifice our lands too, so we get in with. So we can really accelerate this coming out, even if we don't have a ton of creatures left. Obviously, exercise caution here. If you don't want to sacrifice all your lands and then they kill your Greater Gargadon, and you're not really playing Magic anymore. But in the right spot, that can certainly be something worth doing. Particular combo to call out with this is Mayhem Devil, because unlike most of the other payoffs, Mayhem Devil triggers off any permanent. It's not just
it's any permanent being sacrificed.
And Mayhem Devil can kill their creatures, so it can be really nice to your Mayhem Devil. You start sacking your lands, your Mayhem Devil triggers are going to get their blockers out of the way, and then that clears the way for this to hit for 9. And at that point, if you've gotten any other damage over the course of the game, your opponent's probably dead.
Yeah, I do like that one. That one's very cool. Let's keep it in like the like mid-powered queues before we kind of go into some budget ones. Like, are there any other like higher-powered ones you would look to run if you were trying to get this deck to be as good as it can be?
So another one that's worth calling out here, and it's kind of just a busted card, but is particularly excellent in Aristocrats, is Skull Clamp. So obviously here you need specifically 1 toughness creatures in order for this to work as a sack outlet, but it is very much a sack outlet and a payoff. You're getting 2 cards for each time you equip and kill your creature. That's super powerful. You can also, obviously you could equip 2 creatures with more toughness and then sacrifice them to another effect to get your cards out of it. So that's really good. See, it's not free; it's a mana to equip every time, but you're getting such a strong payoff out of it. That's more than acceptable. You don't need me to tell you why Skullcamp's good. Skullcamp's good in lots of decks. It's not just Aristocrats, but this is a great home for it. This is obviously one for the higher power level cubes. You're not going to put Skullcamp in most of your mid to low power level cubes.
And then one last other card that I think is worth mentioning just because I've been really impressed by it is Warren Soul Trader. This is 2 and a black, 3/3, creature, zombie, goblin, wizard. Pay 1 life, sack another creature, create a treasure token. So you can't go infinite with this one because in theory there is a cost that is life, but the not paying mana is amazing. And the fact that you go up in mana with the treasure is really good. And this is another one that's fantastic with a card like Mayhem Devil because it's kind of doubling up your Mayhem Devil triggers. Every time you sack a creature, you ping them for 1 with the Mayhem Devil, and then you get a treasure that you can ping them again.
Yeah,
when
sure.
When you sacrifice that token.
Yeah, it's really powerful. And especially worth note, again, with Mayhem Devil, because it can hit creatures as well. It's not just about killing them, right? It's that incremental value you're getting as the game goes on if you have these 2 creatures in play. It's still a lot of creatures to actually kill them, but just attacking a combat is going to be a nightmare for your opponent. They're going to have to think so hard about all their blocks, about all their attacks, because you can sacrifice your creature, deal damage. Maybe their creature has some damage marks on it from combat. You can finish it off. And because there's no mana attached to any of this, so you have so much control to do this whenever you want. You're really dictating the terms of combat. It's a lot of why Aristocrats tends to have quite a good matchup against the more aggressive decks. Actually, is that just you have a lot of tools to make combat go really well for you and really badly for your opponent.
Yeah, that one's awesome. Yeah, and then when we kind of come down the power level a little bit into more budget and more like beginner friendly cubes, you have I think cards like that's where cards like the Carrion Feeder get a bit more what you're looking for. So like the Carrion Feeder or the Nantuko Husk, like cards that you sack other creatures to make them get bigger or get in for more damage through combat. So you have cards like Bartolome del Presidio and Hammerhead from the recent Marvel set, which are effectively 2 mana, 2/1 with sacrifice another creature or artifact, put a counter on it. I think those are quite solid there. Like it's not as broken in any way as something, or it's why these are less impactful and more for those kind of lower power, slightly lower powered environments is because you're having to attack to get the value out of these creatures, if that makes sense. Whereas with Goblin Bombardment, you just have to have a creature. Whereas it's like an extra step in your chain, and that's why it's a bit lower down the power level, basically.
Yeah, for sure. They can be really powerful on the right board state, but they need a lot more. They need a little bit more to be going their way than the attack outlets that give you a lot just from activating them.
No, completely agree. And as we kind of wrap up the sacrifice outlet part, there will be other ones out there. But the key takeaway, dear listener, is the free part. Everyone we've mentioned, we've not had to pay any mana for. There will be other ones printed in the future as well. If they're free, then they can be considered, basically. It's kind of, I think, the line that we're kind of falling on. Right, so we've got our sack outlets and we've got our fodder. Let's talk about some more payoffs. With payoffs, we've already touched on the Blood Artist, Mayhem Devil, kind of drain or ping effects. But there are other things you can do to win a game. For example, the last time Nantuko Husk was in Standard, the payoff for that deck was Rally the Ancestors. X, white, instant, return each creature card with mana value X or less from your graveyard to the battlefield, exile those creatures at the beginning of your next upkeep, exile Rally the Ancestors. So this is an example, it doesn't have to be this card, but this is some mass recursion. You can sack your whole board, then bring it all back. This is also an instant, which is quite nuts. So you can do it all at instant speed. You can, again, think about that final turn where we're trying to, we know the math. Our opponent doesn't know the math. We're trying to build that situation where we can kill them out of nowhere. And a card like Rally the Ancestors, there's a bunch other like this, a bunch of other bring things back from the graveyard so we can sack him again. They're also payoffs. James, are there any ones kind of in this sort of vein that you quite like?
Yeah, the recursion can be really strong in these decks, partly because it's good in that final turn when we're going for it, but it's also good in those grindy games, right? We don't want to get sucked into the mentality of putting too much emphasis on what happens when we're undisrupted and we get to execute our game plan with all our pieces in play. The reality is our opponent's going to be killing our pieces, and we want ways to bring them back. Another very nice thing with the recursion in Aristocrats decks is that often the weakness of recursive spells in Cube is that our opponents, like a bunch of our opponents' removal is going to exile, and then that kind of breaks our recursion. Aristocrats is actually insulated from that a little bit, because if you have your sacrifice outlet in play and your opponent goes to Swords to Plowshares, your Mayhem Devil, say, you can just sack your Mayhem Devil, and then you get it, and then it's in your graveyard ready to be returned later, which is actually pretty meaningful, I found. So this deck can be excellent homes for things like Recurring Nightmare or Chthonian Nightmare, the newer one. Those go really well here. I think Lurrus, we also mentioned earlier. Even just something like Unearth, the reanimate something with CMC3 or less that cycles can have a really nice home in these decks, because it's powerful when we're proactively putting stuff in our yard, but it's also powerful when our opponent has removed some of our key pieces.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think that's really cool.
And then sort of following on from that, I think just the other key thing to emphasize is probably the easiest way to make this deck effective is to really lean into the sort of strong individual cards that get better with the sacrifice synergies, rather than sort of thinking entirely about the synergies and ignoring the individual standalone power level of the card. Like this isn't a combo deck in the vein of something like Storm or Reanimator, where we're really just focusing on executing our powerful game plan and kind of ignoring what our opponent is doing. This is a deck where we're looking to play a game of Magic with functional Magic cards that make each other better, but we're still interacting with our opponent, and you should be prioritizing good interaction in this deck. Like, we're not going to go quicker than the quickest combo decks. We're not going to kill you faster than the best aggro decks. So we need to be interacting with our opponents. So good removal, hand attack is really important in these decks. As we mentioned earlier, it's best if you can get these effects on creatures, but that's not essential. Like, you'll happily play, a Duress, a Doomblade. These are fine to include in your deck, and you need some amount of them.
Out of interest, how do you feel about a board wipe in an Aristocrat deck? Because it's sort of the base of an Aristocrat deck is kind of combo adjacent in that we're trying to build an engine, but then we also want things to die. So just how do you feel about potentially having a board wipe that wraths everything in there?
I tend not to like it, because the thing is, we want our creatures to die, but mostly we want our creatures to die when we're killing our opponent. At which point we don't actually care about killing our opponent's creatures. So the board wipe is kind of just worse than a sack outlet. And if we're not killing our opponent, sure, like, of course, there'll be spots where the board wipe is powerful, but all the rest of our cards that we play subsequently are much weaker when we don't have a board, right? Like, the way Aristocrats works is you sort of need a bunch of creatures in play to make your other cards function, and once we've wiped our board, it can be difficult to rebuild. I'm not saying you can never do it. Like, you might want to bring one in out of the sideboard, but my default would be to not main deck a board wipe in an Aristocrat stack.
Yeah, no, that tracks. Yeah, that does make sense. And then one other nice thing that can come, which we've touched on a little bit, that can come from running an Aristocrat deck because you have a bunch of these free sacrifice outlets in them, is combos. This can definitely be something that I think kind of pushes up the power level a little bit with this deck. It's kind of is leaning into the combo becomes the win con. It's a nice little like power lever you can run to like up the deck a little bit. Kind of like, what combos do you like specifically, James, if we're already running some of these key cards?
Yeah, for sure. So one you get almost for free, right, is the Gravecrawler stuff, because Gravecrawler is good fodder in this deck. It's not hard to get some zombies in there. Warren Soul Trader we talked about is a very powerful sacrifice outlet, and those two cards combine phenomenally well together. Warren Soul Trader is a zombie. It makes us a mana. We go not quite infinite because we're paying a life each time, but if we have a Blood Artist, for example, it's infinite and our opponent is dead. But even without that, it's it's a lot of death triggers. We only need, if we have almost anything else going on, that's going to be really powerful. There's other enablers for your Gravecrawler stuff. For example, if you have a zombie and Earthcraft, that works. Earthcraft is the enchantment where you can tap your creatures to untapped lands. That effectively lets us get a mana off our Gravecrawler on the way through, and then we can cast it again. So that if we have a good stack outlet, we're going infinite there. Persist combos are also really good. I think this is often one of the better homes for them because we have those stack outlets when we're running anyway. Plus, the persist creatures are just quite good because you get to sacrifice them twice. That's great for an Aristocrats deck. And then the combo part is kind of just the gravy on top of that, right? And we can recur those creatures later. It's a nice way to close out the game with cards that all have other utility in our deck.
Yeah, I'd agree. Like so I think, yeah, as we kind of touched on and in our last episode, like I'm not the biggest fan of persist combos in higher powered level cubes, but in slower cubes, it is a viable combo. And like it really does flourish if you're going ham with Aristocrats. Like if you already have those free sacrifice outlets, then it's almost, I'm not going to say free to like sprinkle in a couple of persist creatures, but it becomes a lot easier. Like you can sprinkle in a Kitchen Finks, you can sprinkle in a Murderous Redcap, and then all you need is a card to, like those cards are fine in the sacrifice decks. They'll just go in anyway for value, and then all you have to do is again sprinkle in a creature or an effect that removes the counter, and then you've got a combo. Like that's a nice little touch that you can add. You don't have to go. I don't have to add every persist creature and every combo card. If you have Aristocrats, you can sprinkle in a bit of these combos, and it's a nice, yeah. They will compete with the other combos at this power level. I'm thinking Splinter 2 and Kiki Jiki. I'm thinking kind of like basically some combos we were running like 5-10 years ago. They will be very good in these like lower power level environments, and like persist combos is very good there.
Yeah, for sure. The other one, which I think is kind of fun, is Luminous Broodmoth.
Yeah, I love this card. Can you read it out for the audience, James? Because it a little bit of a niche one, but it is fun.
Yeah, for sure. So Luminous Broodmoth is 2 white for a 3/4 creature flying insect. It says, whenever a creature you control without flying dies, return it to the battlefield under its owner's control with a flying counter. So firstly, this is actually kind of just a really powerful card.
Yeah, it's an on-rate creature.
Yeah, 3/4 flyer. Your non-flyers just dying into flyers is really powerful. Like, imagine you just have some ground creatures. You play this, you attack with your ground creatures. You're going to get in some damage, and the ones that die just come back as flyers. Like, that's kind of cracked. It's busted with the Evoke Elementals. Like, you play this, you grief them.
Oh, Jesus.
You take a card, the grief comes back, takes another card, and you have a Flying Menace to go with your
Menace.
Flying Menace is busted.
Yeah.
So that's really cool. And I kind of just like this card in Black-White Aristocrats anyway. And then on top of that, there's some like kind of wacky combo stuff you can do where you prevent the flying counters coming on with something like Solemnity, or there's some weird effects which just prevent your creatures from gaining flying. It's kind of interesting. I don't know if it's like a combo you need to lean super hard into in powerful cubes, but it's a cool card. It's a powerful card, and I'm kind of interested in trying a Solemnity if you're running this, for example.
Yeah, like oddly, it's like it's kind of like Rally the Ancestors. It's like a good way of doubling up all your sack triggers because it's giving like it's letting you double dip on all your creatures, but it's on a decent rated flyer that's going to get in for some damage anyway. Like that's actually pretty solid. I do quite like that card. Marvelous. And then kind of like once the deck is actually, and then once the package or archetypes in our cube, kind of like, what is it like to play, James? Kind of like, what are its good matchups? What are its bad matchups? Like, what does it like? How does it perform?
Yeah, so obviously it's going to depend a lot on the specifics of what you've built, but in general, I'd say you do pretty well against people who are trying to attack you on the ground. So like your aggro matchup actually tends to be pretty solid. This is mostly just because we're really good at gumming up the ground with lots of blockers. And to a certain extent, blocking is a sack outlet, you know?
It does count, yeah.
Yeah. And against the aggressive decks, they kind of don't have a lot of choice but to play into that, right? Like the aggressive decks can't really choose not to attack you because, you know, you want your creatures to die. So we tend to be able to put the aggro decks into a pretty tough spot with all of our extra bodies that we're gumming up the ground with. The other thing we tend to do quite well against is actually the very controlling decks where they're not closing the game quickly and they're relying on removal spells because to answer all of our threats. Because so many of our cards make multiple bodies, it's really hard for them to grind through it just with a bunch of removal spells. So that tends to be pretty good. So the flip side, though, of that is the more mid-rangey decks are actually a bit tougher because they tend to have a clock to go with the disruption. They don't need to answer all of your threats. They're just going to use their disruption to break apart your synergies, at which point you're just left with some kind of suboptimal standalone cards if you can't get your synergies going, and then they just have like more powerful mid-range standalone threats, right? That can turn the corner. So that can be a little bit tricky. Fast combo is also pretty challenging unless you've got good hand attack because we're just not going to be able to go. We're often not going to be able to race, right? Like, unless with a very, very aggressive version, this just isn't the fastest deck in most cubes. So racing it can be tough. It's going to be hard to get enough disruption to beat them. So that can certainly be a tricky matchup.
Yeah, definitely, I'd agree with that. I think it is important with this deck to remember that like it is still a cube deck. You still need your ways of interacting. You need you can't just have everything be an engine piece. Like you have to have your removal. You have to have your like cards filtering and selection, that kind of stuff. You have to draft your lands well. You can't just draft every sacrifice out. You can't just draft all three of the bits that we touched on. You can't just draft only sacrifice outlets, only token makers, and only payoffs, because that's not a deck. That's just you've just drafted the screenshot of the package. You haven't drafted a deck, if that makes sense. And then I think kind of one key thing just to finish up on, James, is like what can people do to tune it? So say someone listening already has an Aristocrat deck in their cube and they've listened to this episode and maybe it's not firing on all cylinders. Like, what advice would you give them to like tune up the Aristocrat deck? Like how can we turn that lever to give it a bit more juice to make it more focused?
Yeah, so I think one trap people often fall into slightly with this sort of archetype is I read through all the cards on Cube Cobra and they have this sort of vision in their mind of how it's going to play out, where we're assembling all these really powerful synergies. And obviously that is a thing that the deck can do, but it's important not to get sucked into that best case scenario mentality where all the games are going to be about us maximizing these really powerful synergies that come together when the deck is undisrupted, because in reality, most cube games are very interactive. Our opponent is going to be breaking up our synergies, and we need ways to fight through that. And the kind of the easiest thing I think you can do to make your Aristocrats deck do a bit better is focus more on strong standalone cards, which can function on their own but get better when they start synergizing with each other around the sacrifice synergies, rather than cards which only work when your synergies are already popping. Honestly, it's the kind of the easiest way to build Aristocrats as an effective deck is like a red-black mid-range deck with good interaction, and the threats have some sacrifice synergies with each other, rather than my deck is like all sack outlets and fodder and payoffs, right? Not that you can't lean into that stuff, but it's but I'd say if Aristocrats is struggling in your cube, maybe the cube is like on the higher end of the power level spectrum where Aristocrats works, it's maybe worth like pulling back a little bit on the very, very, very synergy focused cards, and maybe looking to cut them for some more generically powerful stuff, which has some synergistic elements but doesn't rely on the synergies as hard. Because it's just going to mean you can play more, you can do well in different sorts of games. You will still have those games where your engine comes together and it lets you go over the top of your opponent. And that is an important part of the puzzle, but it's not the only thing that's going on. And you want to equip yourself to also win the like low resource games where we're 1-for-1ing a bunch. But my standalone threat is going to be hard for you to interact with, and like my one thing that sticks is actually going to give me a meaningful advantage. I don't need like these 4 different pieces to get my engine going all the time.
Yeah, and the final thing from me anyway is like I think I say this on every episode where we talk about a archetype is remember that it is cube, try not to go full commander. And I mean that lovingly, but I mean that in a way of like because like sources like EDH are like really good at kind of like giving you like, here are all the cool cards for an archetype, and like it puts cards like Ashnod's Altar or like Pitiless Plunderer or a commander like Tater Karlov. These are all kind of like super cool synergistic cards that can go in an aristocrat deck, but they are slower, they don't affect the board as much, and they're not what the aristocrat deck in cube is trying to do. In formats like Commander, where you can build these big Rube Goldberg machine engines, like, yeah, I can have my Ashnod's Altar and make a bunch of infinite mana combos, but in cube, your opponent's going to be beating you down with a Savannah Lion. And if you don't play a creature on 1 or 2 and you play your Ashnod's Altar on 3 and then your synergy piece on 4, like you've lost that game. And no matter the power level of the cube, you need to be impacting the board. You need to be doing things that are actually trying to progress you forward. And kind of like some of the commander traps are just too slow. And if I was like, I think that's one reason why a aristocrat deck may not function in a cube. If you've taken your like when you're looking at like cards to go in, look at like standard decks that have sacrifice themes in them. Look at Canadian Highlander decks. Try and avoid the commander style of environments if you can. Yeah, and that's kind of like a golden rule for any type of cube archetype or strategy. Try and focus on the one-on-one formats because they're way more relevant.
Yeah, for sure. I think with the cards, like Ashnod's Altar is a great example, right? Like powerful build-around-y card, but 0 effect on the board and 3 mana to play. It's not that you can never make these cards work in cube, but you really have to sort of earn the right to put Ashnod's Altar in your deck, you have to surround it with a bunch of stuff that's keeping you alive in order to actually have the time to get that sort of engine piece going. You can't just chuck a bunch of Ashnod's Altar type cards into your deck and see what works out, because sure, they would assemble something powerful on turn 7 or 8, but you will be dead by then.
And specifically with a card like Ashnod's Order, I think it's the perfect example as because it's a powerful card, but like, what does it actually do? It gives us mana. That's not winning us the game. Like, you compare it to a card like Altar of Dementia. The mill on that card can win us the game, or the ping off a Goblin Bombardment. Like even Viscera Seer, it's 1 mana. And it's surveilling us to our next thing. It's doing something the deck wants. It's not just spooting out mana into the ether to do what in theory low to the ground deck. What do we need 5 mana for? We've already got Yawgmoth in play. It'll be fine.
Yeah, for sure. Viscera Seer is also like a creature, right? You can play it on turn 1 and block with it if you want.
And we can sacrifice it to itself to ping that last point of damage with the Blood Artist.
Yeah, sure.
These are all important things to kind of keep in mind.
100%. I think the final thing to just emphasize is you should have some idea of whether you want the Aristocrats deck in your cube to lean more aggressive or to be more mid-rangey, maybe even looking to go in a combo-y direction. And not to say you can only do one of those. But you need to think about it, and you need to make sure that your card choices are actually coherent. You don't want it to be all pulling in different directions, because that's how you end up with an Aristocrat deck that's not really all trying to achieve the same thing. And you can end up with something that's really, really disjointed, even when someone gets a bunch of the good Aristocrats cards. So, yeah, you can have multiple avenues, but you just need to be aware of what they are and tailor your card choices accordingly.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think so. That's why when I had it in my cube and I had it in Rakdos is the aggressive one, and Orzhov was the more grindy one. It was specifically the gold cards that were pushing it in that direction. It was the gold cards that were making the Rakdos deck more aggressive. It was the gold cards that were making the Orzhov deck slower and more grindy. The cards in the middle were cards that could go into both. I wasn't trying to double dip too much on either. And yeah, I think that's very important. Very good point there. All right, marvellous, James. I think that's where we're going to end it for today. Thank you, man. That was a good little chat on a very cool and very popular archetype that, I always love seeing it in a cube.
Oh, yeah, lovely stuff. Thanks, Dan.
All good. Right, just leaves me to thank you all very much for listening. You have been listening to Powerful Nothing. Do make sure you like, share, subscribe, all that good stuff. And until next week, we'll see you all soon. You all take care. Goodbye.